They said that blood would run through the streets. There'd be shootouts on every corner. And they said, actually, we'd become like Texas. I think they had some misconceptions about Texas because Texas has been behind the 8 ball on constitutional carry. But actually what happened was really the opposite.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to the show. I've got a great guest to bring to you today, Eric Brakey, who's a senior spokesperson for Young Americans for Liberty and a former state senator in Maine. Eric, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Hey Brad, the pleasure's all mine. Thanks for having me. I've been reading a lot of your op-eds and your writing over the last year or so. You're a real machine, and I'm glad to be on the program with you.
Yeah, I appreciate it, and I'm a big fan of the work that you guys do, that y'all do at YAL. But that's kind of what I want to talk to you about, because your whole thing is getting people who are on the liberty or libertarian side elected to office. You've had a lot of success with that at the state and local level. You yourself were in the Maine State Senate, and one of the things you championed was something that for some of my listeners, they might not have heard of it. For others, they might think it's a tad controversial, but constitutional carry. It's a more expansive approach to gun rights, but can you start out just by telling us what is constitutional carry?
Well, yeah, constitutional carry at the end of the day is actually pretty simple. There's always a lot of misinformation circling around about what it actually is. But really, at the end of the day, it doesn't change anything about who can carry a firearm or where people can carry firearms. It just changes how people can carry firearms, which is basically if you are a law-abiding citizen who can already own a handgun, that you should be able to carry that handgun open or concealed without having to get a permission slip from the government to do that. Now we are, when I sponsored constitutional carry in Maine, we became the 6th constitutional carry state. That was, about 6 years ago now. And it's the passage of constitutional carry across the country, state by state, has been exponential in recent years. We're up to, in just a very short period of time, we're up to 20 states with 2, potentially more on the way this year. More constitutional carry states added in a single year than any year on record.
Wow. That's quite something. But talk us through, you told me something interesting before we got going, that you actually worked in a bipartisan way to get your constitutional carry legislation. It went through a Democrat-controlled House, right? So can you talk us through, how did it go from start to finish, you get walking that bill over the finish line?
It's funny. This is why I ultimately have no sympathy for Republican-controlled legislatures who say that they can't pass constitutional carry because it's too controversial. In Maine, you're right. We got constitutional carry passed through the Democrat-controlled House of Representatives. It's still, to this date, the only Democrat-majority legislature to ever pass constitutional carry. And the secret, it wasn't anything, I guess, too complicated. It was basically, I identified, who are the squishy the votes in the legislature, and who are the folks on the fence, and including Republicans and Democrats. And I didn't necessarily just go to the politicians and ask them to sign on to constitutional carry. I went to their constituents and got their constituents to flood their email inboxes and make their phones ring off the hook and show up at the Capitol and demand that their legislators vote to restore our Second Amendment rights. And that's ultimately, at the end of the day, what works, because, well, at the end of the day, the Constitution still gives every single voter the constitutional authority to fire the politicians come re-election season, and the politicians know it. So when you get 500 phone calls from constituents, you start to take notice.
Yeah, and that's even easier to do at the state level. With Congress, they have so many constituents.
That's right.
That's one of the cool things about state politics. Stuff can still happen. But so what exactly changed? Can you tell us what it looked like in Maine in terms of the permitting process before and after your bill?
Right. So in Maine, we already had permitless open carry. It was simply, you would have to get a concealed carry permit in order to basically put a jacket on. And so I argued that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Why is the difference between being a law-abiding citizen and a felon, whether or not you're wearing a piece of cloth? And especially in Maine, it can get cold outside. So sometimes you want to throw a jacket on and not be treated like a criminal. So we just kind of removed that artificial distinction. We kept the permitting process in place as a voluntary thing because, frankly, so many states did not have constitutional carry at that point in time, and we wanted to have reciprocity with other states. You can get so you could get your permit still and go carry in New Hampshire and Texas and other places that were behind the 8 ball. But then New Hampshire passed constitutional carry. Texas is about to, they've passed it through the House and the Senate here. It seems that even having the optional permit is less and less necessary these days as so many states come on board. And I really have to hand it to, folks here at Young Americans for Liberty taking this model and applying it across the country, not only in electing liberty legislators to state capitals, like I was when I was in the Senate. There were maybe if you were really generous, you could count maybe 10 kind of liberty-minded Ron Paul style state legislators across the country. Now we're well over 150. And we've been applying this we call it the confrontational politics model to pass things like constitutional carry state by state, going not to the politicians and asking them nicely, but going to their constituents and empowering them to demand that their legislators vote the right way.
But you do have a lot of powerful interest groups that oppose stuff like constitutional carry or even concealed carry, frankly. What did the gun controllers say when you were working on this legislation? And then how did those kinds of critics and then reality compare?
Yeah, they made all kinds of dire predictions. I remember in Maine specifically, the opposition was primarily coming from national groups funded by New York City billionaire Michael Bloomberg. He's been the big financier of the gun control movement, across the country. And the predictions we heard from these kind of affiliated groups like Everytown was basically, they said that Maine would become the wild, wild west. They said that blood would run through the streets. There'd be shootouts on every corner. And they said, actually, we'd become like Texas. I think they had some misconceptions about Texas because Texas has been behind the 8 ball on constitutional carry. But actually what happened was really the opposite. Not only did none of their predictions come true, Maine climbed the rankings to become the safest state in America. According to U.S. News and World Reports, we've been the safest state in America for now, every year since then. So what is that going on? 6 years now? We've been at the top of the charts. In fact, the top 3 of the 5 safest states in America are all constitutional carry states. And it makes a certain kind of sense because if you're relying on gun control laws to keep you safe, who follows gun control laws? It's not the criminals who are going to violate the law anyway to commit acts of violence against people. They're no more likely to get a permit to carry a firearm than they're likely to get a permit to rob a bank. But it's law-abiding citizens who want to, stay in compliance with the law, who are more likely to say, well, geez, if I don't have all the proper paperwork, maybe I should leave my firearm at home. And that creates an environment where people can't defend themselves, and it allows predators to prey upon innocent people. So, there's the old saying, an armed society is a polite society. I think it's proven pretty true with constitutional carry.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the idea of a gun-free zone, right?
Right.
Who actually walks into a gun-free zone and says, "Oh, can't bring my gun in there"? Does not follow that logic.
I was planning to rob this bank, but now I see it's a gun-free zone. So, well, geez, I guess I better change my plans.
But so yeah, what's the state of play across the country on constitutional carry?
Well, here's the thing that's so encouraging to me. So I said earlier that it's really gone exponential, and I mean that. So if you look through kind of the last, let's go back to the Bush administration. I know that's maybe ancient history for a young guy like you, but I grew up under the Bush administration, and back in those days, you had, at the end of the Bush administration, you had a total of 2 constitutional carry states in the country. You had Vermont, which for the long time it was just called Vermont style carry. Vermont has always had constitutional carry just because since the founding of Vermont, they just never passed any gun control laws until very recently. ironically, they got a Republican governor who signed some gun control laws. They've actually fallen down the rankings since then. They used to be the safest state in America, no more. But Vermont was the first constitutional carry state. And then in 2003, Alaska, kind of like out of the blue, passed constitutional carry. But nothing really for years until after that, until we got to the Obama administration. As you may remember, and your viewers may remember, Barack Obama was very aggressive on advocating for gun control. Didn't have a lot of success in getting things passed on the federal level. But what he did create was basically a counter movement on the state levels from Second Amendment minded, freedom minded conservatives who took up constitutional carry as kind of an answer to the federal gun control push. And we saw constitutional carry pass in Obama's first term in 2 more states, in Arizona and in Wyoming. So in Obama's first term, it doubled. And then in Obama's second term, as he doubled down on gun control again, the amount of constitutional carry states doubled to 9, Maine being on that list. And then in Trump's first term, it doubled again to 16. And as I said, this year we've passed more constitutional carry states than any year on record. It looks likely we're at 20 now. With the addition of Texas and Louisiana, it looks like we may get to 22, which is really making me think that, perhaps by the end of Biden's first term, if this trend keeps up, we should get to 32. Cross my fingers. Maybe that's a little optimistic. I don't think it can double from that point. I don't think we can get to 64 constitutional carry states unless we start adding states right and left like the Democrats want to do. But
wow. And something tells me you're not going to get it passed in California anytime soon.
I think they might be the last to hold out, but maybe the state of Jefferson, if it ever comes into being. But it is interesting to see a policy issue where actually change is happening rapidly, because oftentimes, and maybe that's because it's at the state level, when things go through Washington, they move as slow as molasses. But why should this be something in terms of gun rights, self-defense? Why should constitutional carry be a priority? Well, I think that personally, I believe that the Second Amendment is foundational to a free society. It really is the defender, the right to keep and bear arms is the kind of last line of defense for, our unalienable rights, as Thomas Jefferson called them. Once you kind of take that kind of cornerstone, keystone kind of right away, I think a lot of the rest of our freedoms kind of fall away as well, because those who would impose tyranny on us know that they're not going to get a lot of pushback, that they can push us a lot further, because all we'll be able to do is grumble and complain if the people can't be armed for self-defense. So I think it's foundational. It has to be protected. And I think that especially in these times when you've got, Joe Biden, who is, making as aggressive, if not more of an aggressive push for gun control on the federal level than even Barack Obama did. I mean, calling for banning and confiscating commonly owned firearms like, AR-15 rifles, which are frankly functionally no different than a hunting rifle. He's appointed, he's nominated David Chipman, who's going to be, he intends for him to be his enforcer to lead the ATF, which is a gun confiscation agency. David Chipman is someone who has defended the ATF's use of fully automatic machine guns against American citizens in Waco. So he's obviously, he's not against guns. He's just against the American citizens having guns. He's all for the government using guns against the American people. And he's also called for, red flag gun confiscation orders, which would basically allow government agents to individually target American citizens for confiscation of their firearms, not on the basis of any crime that has been committed, but on the basis of pre-crime, like out of that movie Minority Report, on the idea and the suspicion that someone might commit a crime in the future. How do you defend yourself against something you might do in the future? You can't really, and that's probably part of the reason why there's no due process involved. You don't get a day in court. You don't even get any notice. The only notice you're entitled to is the knock on your door at 5 a.m. when government agents are there to confiscate your firearms, which is a dangerous situation for everyone involved, the police officers and for the American citizens. So I think that it's especially important that we do take up the fight for the Second Amendment on the state level. And constitutional carry, in addition to kind of eliminating the need to kind of have this permission slip from the government, it does something else that's very valuable too. I think that folks in the Second Amendment movement, we know that we don't like gun registries because we know that, you know, a firearms registry is one of the necessary components to gun confiscation. But these kind of permit registries are kind of like gun owner registries. So government might not know what the individual firearms are that are out there, but they know who the people are who have them. And I think that the more we move away from these registries and permitting systems, the more difficult we make it for any, you know, government gun grabbers to kind of crack down on gun ownership in America.
But so some listeners might be thinking of this and saying, what's the harm in a permitting process, right? It doesn't, is there not some value in making sure that people who are going to carry a gun have gone through a safety course, pass a background check, or other things? What do you say to that kind of argument that we need that structure?
Well, the first thing I would say, so there's, I think, two arguments built in there. So let me tackle them one at a time. The idea of kind of the background check. And I get background checks sound so great, and it's like, why? Oh, yeah, everyone should support a background check, right? Except that background checks are so easy to sidestep that they're essentially all it really amounts to is a tax on legal gun owners. Because if you're not allowed to have a firearm legally, you can do something called like a straw purchase, where someone basically you get someone to purchase it for you who can pass the background check. Or people go to the black market. So there's so many ways around the background check system. It doesn't actually accomplish much at all, except erecting barriers to law-abiding citizens. But there's the more kind of, but then there's the argument you mentioned about training. And shouldn't we have training requirements? And I got to say, this is the argument I'm the most sympathetic to. But I think that when you actually look at the facts, you realize that there's some problems with some of the base assumptions here. So when you have mandatory minimum training requirements to carry a firearm, what this actually does is it kind of creates two tiers in kind of the kinds of training institutions that are out there. You have really fantastic training institutions, what I would call centers of excellence, where you get hands-on training from knowledgeable instructors who teach you not just the laws of the state, but you'll often get time in the range where they kind of go through the whole process with you. That's really the kind of training that is excellent, and we want everyone to have. I want people to have, who are going to carry firearms, to be trained on how to use them safely, just like I'd want someone who's using a chainsaw to know how to use it safely. It is a dangerous tool, and if you don't know what you're doing with a chainsaw, you're going to cut your arm off. If you don't know what you're doing with a firearm, you're going to hurt yourself or someone else. So we want that training. But the permitting requirement, the mandatory minimum training requirements also really what it creates is this secondary kind of source of training, we'll call it in quotes, which I would call just certificate mills, where everyone's going through the motions that there's some kind of training going on here. But really, the goal is not the training. The goal is the piece of paper that you get at the end of the day that the government says you need to have to carry. Now, as we have eliminated those requirements, the centers of excellence haven't gone away. In fact, they've gotten more business than ever because people are going for the training. But the certificate mills have seen a huge blow in business because people value the training, not the piece of paper. So I think that ultimately that's a good thing. And also we have seen overall in states that pass constitutional carry, despite kind of conventional wisdom, training, the demand for training overall just increases. We saw this in Arizona. We've seen this in Maine. We've seen this in states across the country. So mandates don't necessarily create more training. And sometimes it just kind of creates plateaus where people feel like, I've got this met this minimum threshold, I don't need more. But really, responsible gun owners will tell you, you want to be in a continual process of training.
So one thing that I comes to mind when I think of this is there are some people, and I actually don't know what your general thoughts on this, but as a society, our laws have declared some people unfit for gun ownership. Convicted felons, convicted murderers who get out, convicted rapists, people on the sex offender registry in many states. these kinds of felons cannot buy or own guns. It's illegal for them to do so. If you don't have a permitting process or some sort of certification, can you still enforce those kinds of restrictions, or do they become more or less null and void?
Yeah, I mean, certainly those can be enforced. I mean, we could have a broader conversation about the wisdom of those policies. I personally think when someone has committed a violent crime, I think that that's very justifiable for someone to kind of be prohibited. Sometimes people are prohibited for nonviolent crimes, and I think that's more questionable. But yeah, it certainly can be enforced. I mean, there's a record of, if you have a felony record, that's a record. You can show that someone who was, carrying, you can look up that record and it can be proven that they were a prohibited person. So yeah, I don't see any conflict with being able to enforce those laws. And but basically, I think what those who are saying that we need to have this permitting system to ensure that people who are carrying aren't convicted felons. Well, basically, you'd be taking a core principle of kind of American jurisprudence and turning it on its head, which is you're supposed to be innocent until proven guilty. You're not supposed to have to prove that you're innocent in order to exercise your rights. You're supposed to be able to exercise your rights, and if people want to deny you your ability to exercise your rights, they need to prove that you're guilty. And so, I reject this idea that law-abiding citizens need to go through extra hurdles to prove that they're innocent in order to exercise their basic constitutional freedoms.
Yeah, I think this gets to the biggest problem I have with the permits, because this isn't my issue. I'm not a diehard absolutist. If you could tell me that there just was some check that people had to go through and they could get a permit, I wouldn't get too worked up about that. But the permit process for concealed carry, for example, gives governments, local governments who are anti-gun, a way to essentially get around the Second Amendment. So I'm thinking of New York in particular, where it's like they have a concealed carry, but they went from, and the specifics of this, but they basically just don't give them out, or they find every reason to not give them out and go out of their way to deny people the licenses for one technicality or another. I was talking to someone the other day, I don't even remember who it was, but they were telling me they could not get their carry license because they just said no, didn't give a reason. Yeah. So can you talk about how those systems can be abused?
Well, it's funny you bring that up because, it reminds me immediately of a story. Actually, one of the Democrats who co-sponsored constitutional carry in Maine when I was leading that effort, who was one of our most enthusiastic supporters of constitutional carry, which frankly would surprise some folks because not only was he a Democrat, he was a very progressive Democrat. He was his name is Craig Hickman. Now he was in the House then. Now he's in the state Senate, and he was is a openly gay black man, and he told me that he had at one point, put in the paperwork to get a concealed carry permit, and in Maine there was something associated with a concealed carry permit called a good moral character clause, which is totally subjective, and it basically allowed the government agents to deny someone a concealed carry permit on the basis that they felt like they didn't meet whatever that subjective standard was of good moral character. Now, they don't have to say why. They don't have to say what, but for some reason, this gay black man who applied for a concealed carry permit was denied on the basis of a good moral character clause. And so, yeah, this is, I mean, we can all kind of, we can all speculate the reasons why he may have been denied. And so he was one of our biggest supporters of constitutional carry because he experienced firsthand the way that these permitting systems can be used to discriminate against, to be used to discriminate against people. So yeah, there's absolutely room for abuse, especially when there is subjectivity in these how these permits are issued.
And when it comes to the overall movement with guns, it seems like there's two forces pulling in two different directions. Because in one sense, I mean, I just reported on this today, but in May of 2021, 1.3 million guns were purchased. That's the highest monthly total ever recorded for listeners. Yeah. Except for May of 2020, which was even higher. And there is this rising support at the state level among the citizens for gun rights, for self-defense. I think a lot of people were really disturbed watching, rioting and looting that went unpunished in many cities across the country. Police here in Washington, D.C. for several nights stood down and didn't enforce the rule of law. You had all sorts of stories that went viral of like black business owners standing outside with a firearm, and their one shop is the one that doesn't get looted. But at the same time, you have this increasing push for gun control. Democrats, at least the ones in Washington, a lot of them are moving further and further to the left. The momentum among these Mike Bloomberg groups, young progressives, seems to be rising. Are you optimistic or pessimistic for the future of gun rights the next 10 to 15 years?
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to tell. I think a lot is going to depend on what happens in the near future. I mean, it's truth be told, it's pretty terrifying that Joe Biden is planning to put in charge of the ATF a gun control activist who has shown no qualms about the government using lethal force, including military-grade weapons, against American citizens. And so I am concerned that if they push this gun control agenda through on the federal level, that, this might be a guy really crazy enough to kind of do the kind of enforcement of those kind of gun bans they're calling for that would be necessary. Because American people, by and large, are not going to give up their firearms without a fight. And if they really try to do that, there will be blood in the streets. And I am terrified about where that could lead. So I think it's very important that all American people who value the Second Amendment, frankly, just American people who value peace and value the rule of law and value the Constitution, should call their U.S. senators and tell them to vote no on David Chipman to lead the ATF. I think that would be a very dangerous appointment. But on the state level, I am encouraged, because I think that the state legislators, especially some of the legislators who are leading the charge from Young American for Liberty's Hazlitt Coalition, are really leading the charge and kind of pointing out that the states have a role to play in standing up to these unconstitutional federal policies. And so not only do you see the passage of constitutional carry across the country, you also see new pushes for basically nullifying these federal laws. You have the Second Amendment Protection Act, which has been pushed and passed in several states, basically saying that all federal gun control, if it tries to regulate firearms that are made in the state, sold in the state, and used in the state, do not apply, because their whole justification for that is interstate commerce. Well, if there's no interstate commerce going on, they've got a very kind of weak legal argument to make for that. And then you also have some states that have been taking up, basically proactively trying to nullify these federal red flag pushes that the Biden administration is talking about. So basically saying that we're not going to enforce that in our state. And in fact, frankly, I'd love to see federal agents. I'd love to see the states defend their citizens from federal agents trying to enforce these gun control laws, trying to arrest people for exercising their Second Amendment rights. I'd love for states to go even further and say, we're going to arrest federal officials for kidnapping when they try to arrest, our own citizens for just following the Constitution. So I think that the states are getting bolder, and I think that that's encouraging. But I have less and less hope that anything good is going to come from Washington, D.C.
Yeah, I certainly understand that sentiment. And let's hope it doesn't come to all of that. And maybe this is an optimistic point, but I look at people like Neil Gorsuch on the Supreme Court, and many of the judges, I certainly had my criticisms and concerns about the Trump administration, but they put a lot of good judges on the federal bench. Are you optimistic that the judiciary, a lot of these conservative judges, including the Supreme Court, will stand up for the Second Amendment, because they have dodged this issue in the past?
Yeah, I hope so, but I don't think that we should count on it. I think that, if we just sit around waiting for the Supreme Court to defend the Constitution, then I think we're missing opportunities that are closer to home in the state legislatures. But certainly if they do follow through, and they haven't done a very good job of defending the Constitution for at least the last 100 years or so, as we've seen, just kind of, I mean, where's the Supreme Court been, standing against the Patriot Act or against NSA spying or so many of the very blatant violations of the Constitution that have taken place in recent memory. So I don't think we should count on it. I think at the end of the day, federal judges are still employees of the federal government, and I think that there's an implicit federal bias there. But if we do get some good things out of the Supreme Court, great. One of the things I am very concerned about, though, is the kind of chilling effect that, there's an implicit threat to all the justices on the Supreme Court right now. It is basically, hey, if you rule in favor of the Second Amendment or in favor of originalist interpretation of the Constitution, the threat that's hanging over their head is that the Democrats are going to pack the courts. I mean, they're very blatant about it. And so they're wielding this as a threat. So I wonder what kind of chilling effect that's going to have on the justices who are there now, that they think that, well, if we get too proactive in kind of defending the Bill of Rights, that that they're going to pack the courts. So we'll see what happens. But I think we should focus our energies on fighting back closer to home.
And constitutional carry at the state level is a good way to do that. Eric, well, I think we can wrap up the topic there. There will be links in the description to your social media page and some work you've done on this subject for people who are interested in finding out more. But we have to get to the most important question, the most important part of every podcast episode that we do. Hit us with your controversial food opinion.
This is a question you ask everyone, right?
Yeah, I've had some crazy answers. I think, who was it? Steve Forbes told me that he likes sandwiches with peanut butter and bacon. Rand Paul really hates mayonnaise and thinks there's a conspiracy of people who like mayonnaise trying to sneak it into other people's food. I've had some weird ones, but yeah, I have plenty of my own. But you got one for us?
Well, you know what? As a Mainer, I'll tell you, my personal favorite food is lobster. Now, that's not the controversial thing. A lot of people like lobster. But here's the secret, is that there's no such thing as a Maine lobster from away. We have this kind of problem with Canadian lobsters. They call them Gulf of Maine lobsters because they come out of the Gulf of Maine, and they kind of steal Maine's branding on lobsters. So my controversial opinion is there's no such thing as a Maine lobster from away. Make sure you're getting a real Maine lobster, not a fake Canadian lobster called the Gulf of Maine lobster. And also, lobster, way better than Maryland crabs. Oh. Sorry for all my friends in Maryland.
I'm not a big seafood guy, but I bet some people will have strong opinions on that. Eric Brakey, Young Americans for Liberty, everybody. Thanks so much for coming on.